Kansas, 2013. Danielle Zimmerman was waiting in a Taco Bell drive-thru when she suffered a fatal brain aneurysm. Her truck smashed into the speaker box. Allegedly, 3 employees came to her rescue and stole her purse, iPhone, and the wedding ring right off her finger. 2 of the 3 suspects were caught and charged, but the Zimmerman family cannot believe how people can be so cold-hearted.
Helen Keller lost her sight and hearing at the age of 19 months. Despite this hardship, Helen became an author and a disability rights advocate. In her book, My Religion, Helen tells of how she once traveled to Athens without ever going there. She wrote, "I have been far away all this time. And I haven't left the room. It was clear to me that it was because I was a spirit that I had so vividly seen and felt a place 1,000 miles away. Space was nothing to spirit."
2018. Klaus O., not his real name, no. German law unfortunately requires his name not to be revealed. So Klaus O. it is. This man has been sentenced to life in prison. What for? Well, he didn't like his coworkers. I mean, he really didn't like his coworkers. He didn't like them so much that he would go through their lunches and add toxic chemicals, such as mercury and lead, to each meal. Klaus was only caught when one of his unsuspecting victims found a white powder on his sandwich. Hidden cameras were set up and caught Klaus in the act. Police searched Klaus's home and found a makeshift lab where the madman kept his deadly metals. 21 of Klaus's former colleagues have died due to mysterious circumstances since 2000. Police believe Klaus is responsible, but insufficient evidence keeps Klaus free of those charges. Klaus was sentenced to life in prison for attempted murder. Here are some more disturbing facts from this case. 2 of his coworkers suffered serious kidney damage, while a third is in a vegetative state due to brain damage. That person is unlikely to recover. Colorado, 2005. Barr Lake, Colorado is a nature lover's dream. Buffalo, elk, and wolves roam around the majestic prairie. Boaters and fishermen enjoy the sparkling springs. However nice the amenities, the Thomases were moving out of their Barr Lake home. It was simply time to move on. They were glad they did, after one family member suffered a violent encounter with the unknown. Ann Thomas had been going back to the house to clean before ownership changed hands. One morning, the woman was alone in the downstairs bathroom mopping. As she leaned into the bathroom from the hallway, something hit her hard on the back. It felt like someone punched her. However, no one was there. Ann thought something fell on her. No, everything in the house had already been moved. Ann's back remained red for several days after the assault. To this day, the woman has no idea who hit her or why. Hong Kong, 1999. A 23-year-old nightclub hostess was kidnapped by 3 men and one of the men's 13-year-old girlfriend after allegedly stealing a wallet from one of them. They took her to an apartment where they beat and tortured her daily, all over a cash amount of $2,560. After a month, the hostess died as a result of injuries. She was then dismembered. Her skull was placed inside a Hello Kitty mermaid doll, and the men discarded the rest of her remains. Only the woman's skull, one tooth, and some internal organs were recovered. The girlfriend of one of the men led police to the scene. The 3 men were convicted of manslaughter because the remains were not sufficient to show whether the victim was murdered or died in any other way. However, the trio were sentenced to life in prison. Belgium, 1944. An American B-17 made an unscheduled and unplanned landing at an Allied airbase. The RAF unit couldn't get a hold of the crew by radio. The landing was rough, but the men figured it was an emergency, so they prepared for the worst. They didn't prepare themselves for what came next. The plane came to a stop, but its engines roared on. No one approached the plane for several minutes. When they did, they found the plane completely void of life. Half-eaten candy bars and a magazine were the only signs that the crew had been on the plane. The parachutes were still stowed away. It appeared that the plane flew and landed itself. It's assumed the plane's engines malfunctioned after taking a hit. The crew tossed what they could to lighten the load, but it was not enough. They bailed out of the plane, leaving the landing to fate. Michigan, 2012. Brian Curtis Heil found love online. It was real. He saw pictures of the gorgeous blonde. She had to be real. Unfortunately, the woman lived in South Africa. And unfortunately, the woman turned out to be a man. Yes, Brian Curtis Heil was catfished. He became brokenhearted, mad, and determined to get revenge. Instead of flying over to South Africa to beat the guy's ass, Heil decided to take his frustrations out on the woman whose pictures he fell in love with. Apparently, the woman did not know her photos were being used by creeps around the globe. Heil scoured the internet for information on the woman and tracked her down to her home in California. With zip ties, duct tape, and a plan, he drove to Cali to kill the woman. He told his family of his plan, and in turn, they called the police. Heil was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison for his crime. Missouri. The house is called Hobo Hill. It's named for the sheer volume of homeless people who have historically occupied the land. A family bought the home in 2017. A few months after moving in, they witnessed odd sounds and even odder images. The husband and father heard the same sound in the attic every night at 11:15. It sounded like the dropping of a heavy box, followed by a dragging sound, as if someone was moving it across the attic floor. He also experienced the sensation of someone jumping on his neck every time he was in the basement. The 7-year-old daughter began sleepwalking, something she had never done before or since once the family fled the house. Sleepwalking was not the only weird thing she did. She began to speak in tongues while shuffling around with her head tilted to one side. The family dog refused to go near the stairs. The stairs. That was where the family kept seeing a man wearing a suit and a top hat. A man who would always vanish into thin air. Desperate, the family contacted a priest and paranormal investigators to help them cleanse their home. According to one investigator, hundreds of spirits lived in the basement. Could they have been the homeless people who had once squatted on the land? After 7 months, the family moved out. The wife's mother became caretaker to the property. She claims to have heard footsteps in the attic. Heavy footsteps. She was also knocked off a stepladder while painting. Alabama, 1991. Joining a cult can be hazardous to one's health, as William Alt discovered. He worked in a traveling carnival with Jimmy Pinnock, Mark Goodwin, and Keith and David Lawrence. The foursome reportedly engaged in satanic activity. Alt wanted to join in on the fun. After he was denied entry, he used his knowledge about a murder Pinnock committed to blackmail his way into the cult. One evening, the five men went to a secluded farm building. Alt was asked to lie down on a makeshift altar where he was tied and gagged. Using a knife, Pinnock made a deep cut on Alt from the neck to the stomach. The other men also made cuts in the form of an inverted cross. Pinnock then asked Alt if he was ready to die. After Alt answered, Pinnock slit his throat. The men cut off Alt's head and hands and attempted to burn them. The four men and a female accomplice used money stolen from Alt to have dinner at a local Arby's. Pinnock pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Another chilling ghost story from ancient Greece comes from the writer Plutarch. In Charanoa, Greece, a boy named Damon was the object of affection for a Roman military commander. Damon rejected the commander time after time. The commander's love turned to rage. Damon realized the commander's rage could, and probably would, turn deadly. Damon gathered a group of friends and set out to kill the Roman commander. Their plan worked. The commander, along with several other Roman soldiers, died in an ambush. The city council condemned Damon and his friends to death. Before he could be executed, Damon had each council member killed. Damon and his friends fled to the countryside and plundered it, becoming some of the worst criminals ancient Greece saw. Time passed. The townspeople allowed Damon to return to his home. The details are murky, but he was killed shortly afterward in the local bathhouse. Then, certain phantoms appeared in that place. Groans were heard. The bathhouse was shuttered, but the sights and sounds of dead men continue to this very day. 1994 to 1997. Joseph Di Mambro and Luc Jouret formed the Order of the Solar Temple, or the OST, in 1984. The religious sect believed Jesus was a solar god who would eventually return to Earth. Regardless of what they believe, the crimes associated with the cult have smeared its good name. In 1994, a sect member's 3-month-old son was stabbed to death with a wooden stake. No, the kid wasn't a vampire. It's rumored that one of the sect leaders ordered the murder, believing the boy to be the Antichrist. Di Mambro and 12 followers held a Last Supper. A few days later, suicides were reported throughout Switzerland. OST members and their families. 53 in total. Some consumed poison. Some shot themselves. Adults and children dead because of their devout beliefs. On December 23, 1995, 16 bodies were discovered in the Vercors Mountains of France. 2 of them shot the others and then committed suicide by shooting themselves and then setting themselves on fire. On March 23, 1997, 5 members killed themselves in Quebec. They were found in a burning house. If there have been more mass suicides since, then they have not been publicized. California. Jean Harlow was a Hollywood actress and sex symbol throughout the 1930s. She lived in Beverly Hills with her abusive husband, Paul Bern. In 1932, Bern shot himself in the head while standing in front of a mirror. Their butler discovered him and called the movie studio which had Harlow under contract. Yes, he called the movie studio instead of the police. Thus began the rumors that the death was not a suicide. Many suspected Bern's ex-girlfriend killed the man. The woman jumped off a boat to her death a couple days after. Harlow soon moved out after Bern's death, but died a few years later at the age of 26. In 1963, celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring bought the home. He lived there with his girlfriend Sharon Tate until Tate left him for Roman Polanski. One night, Tate was alone in the house, sleeping in the master bedroom. She woke up, feeling the presence of someone standing near her. She saw a creepy little man. Without a second's hesitation, she ran out of the room and into another horrifying scene. She saw a hanging corpse in the hallway, its throat slit and flowing blood. It was believed that the ghost was of Paul Bern. An interesting postscript. Jay Sebring and Sharon Tate remained friends until both of them were murdered by the Charles Manson cult. Sharon Tate was the same age as Jean Harlow when she passed. California, 2019. Tristan Baudet and his 2 young daughters were camping in the Malibu area. While they slept, Baudet was shot in the chest and died. His children were uninjured. This was just the latest mysterious shooting in a series of campsite incidents stretching back to 2016. Anthony Rada was arrested when police were hunting an armed prowler in Los Angeles. Evidence directed them to name him the suspect in the murders. During a 3-year period, Rada allegedly shot campers and cars, even shooting a man who lounged in a hammock. If convicted, he faces life in prison. Ancient Greece. Ghost stories are not a recent invention. In ancient Rome, Roman senator Pliny the Younger held fast to this one until he died in 113 AD. A large estate in Athens was abandoned, and rightfully so. In the dead of night, one could hear a noise come from the house. A noise which, if you dared to listen closely, sounded like the rattling of chains. And if you dared to listen closely and heard these chains, then you might see the form of an old man. Skinny, almost malnourished, and completely disheveled with dirt and grime. With chains, those ghostly chains, around his wrists and ankles. No one knows if Pliny experienced this specter firsthand, or if he made up the tale. A philosopher named Athenodorus was enthralled by this story, so he rented the house, hoping to confront the ghost. To the philosopher's shock and awe, the ghost appeared the first night, rattling his chains before vanishing. Athenodorus noted the spot where the ghost vanished. The next day, he hired workers to dig up that spot. There, beneath the house, was the skeleton of a man wrapped in chains. The corpse was given a proper burial, and the ghost never appeared again. Florida, 1996. A vampire cult sounds cool, right? A bunch of misfits pretending to be vampires? Sounds awesome. Well, in this instance, it wasn't. Rod Ferrell was the alleged leader of the Vampire Clan, a band of similarly disenfranchised youth. Heather Wendorf met Ferrell in school and soon became part of the group that sometimes drank each other's blood. Because that's what vampires do, right? Ferrell moved back to his hometown, but kept in touch with Wendorf. The teenage girl claimed she was miserable at home. Since vampires stick up for each other, Ferrell and 3 other teenagers drove to Wendorf's home and beat Wendorf's father to death with a crowbar. Wendorf's mother tried to fight off Ferrell, throwing hot coffee on him. Ferrell beat her to death, too. Rod Ferrell is currently serving life in prison. New York, 2001. Tammy Jones, a nurse at a nursing home, was stuck working the night shift due to a staff shortage. Most of the residents were in various stages of dementia. The work was physically and mentally demanding. This particular night was oddly quiet, until a call light came on from an empty room. Jones thought a wandering patient did it. She was correct. To her surprise, the elderly man was naked. He stood facing the far corner of the room, banging his head against the wall. Jones was familiar with this resident. She knew he was bedridden due to a broken back. She called his name. He slowly turned and disappeared. Jones ran to his room down the hall. There she found the man in bed, eyes closed. He had just passed away in his sleep. Wisconsin, 1976 and 2019. David Schultz and his fiancée Ellen Matthews went on a camping trip. Shortly after finding a suitable campsite, Schultz was shot in the neck. Matthews was then sexually assaulted and shot to death as she dressed. No arrest was ever made until 2019, when DNA found on Matthews led forensic investigators to a local family. 3 brothers became the prime suspects. Police used their trash to narrow the list further to 1, Raymond Vanderwoven. To get his DNA, police conducted a fake survey where they had Raymond lick and seal an envelope. From there, investigators matched his DNA to the semen found at the crime scene. Raymond currently awaits trial.
Italy, 1731. Cornelia Zangari Bandi was an Italian noblewoman whose death overshadows any deed she committed in life. During her last dinner, the 66-year-old countess was described as dull and heavy. Her maid accompanied her to her room, where they spent several hours praying. The maid left when the countess fell asleep. The next day, the maid went to wake Bandi. To her horror, she found the charred remains of the noblewoman. The room was full of soot. The body of the countess had been reduced to a pile of ashes several feet from the bed. However, her lower legs below the knee, 3 fingers and the front of her skull were all intact. The bed and the rest of the furniture were not scorched. Instead, they were covered by a layer of grease. On the floor was a lamp covered with ashes, but there was no trace of oil. It seemed the Countess perished due to spontaneous human combustion, but this cannot be confirmed.
Missouri, 1989. Dan Short was the president of his town's bank. On a cold October morning, his body was found taped to a chair in Grand Lake, several miles from the bank. It was believed he was unconscious, but alive at the time he was thrown into the river. Bank security cameras were damaged, and $70,000 was missing from the vault. Authorities believed Short's killers abducted him from his home in the middle of the night and took him to the bank. There, they forced him to give them the money. From there, they taped him to a kitchen chair with weights attached and drove him to Grand Lake, where they dumped him. Dan Short drowned to death. His killers were apprehended, where they either died in prison or currently await execution. Indiana, 1967. Jake Nolan was getting off late from his construction job. Tired and hungry, he just wanted to be home. On his way, he saw a man his age walking toward him. He clearly saw it was someone he went to school with. Frankie Jacobs was the man's name. Nolan quickly crossed the street because he didn't want to talk to anyone, even someone he hadn't seen in years. He just wanted to be home. Jacobs didn't notice him, and both went their separate ways. The next morning, Nolan was having breakfast with his mother when he mentioned seeing Jacobs. His mother went pale. She had kept relations with Jacob's mother and was on the phone with her the previous day. See, Jacob's mother called to say that her son had died, killed in an ambush in Vietnam. 2018. A retired doctor, David Crichton, allegedly went on the deep web to order the killing of his financial advisor, whom he believed lost money. Crichton would have paid $5,000 in Bitcoin to see the hit through. He was arrested and charged for solicitation to commit murder and 3 charges of sending a malicious communication. Hopefully, his financial advisor got in a new line of work. Apparently, the site Crichton used also featured other options such as beat the shit out of him and set his house on fire. You can't say the deep web isn't full of options. Thailand, 2019. At the end of a screening of the horror film Annabelle Comes Home, an elderly man was found dead by another moviegoer. Foul play was not suspected, but the true cause of death remains unknown. Was he scared to death? Or is there a real Annabelle curse? Florida, 2019. 2 Best Buy delivery men, Jorge Luis Depre Lechazo and David Gonzalez, delivered and set up an elderly woman's new washer and dryer. Gonzalez had to make a call to the office, so he stepped outside. A few moments later, he heard screams from inside the house. He ran inside and saw blood. Then, he saw the woman's burning body. His co-worker, Lechazo, had slipped out and was speeding away in the delivery truck. He was soon caught and admitted to police that he beat the woman to death with a mallet and then poured acetone on her. He set her on fire and fled the scene. Lechazo has been charged with first-degree murder, first-degree arson, and armed burglary with battery. Tokyo. Terano Masakado was a samurai who was killed in 940 AD after declaring himself emperor after a series of deadly power plays. In the 19th century, his gravesite became the grounds of the country's financial ministry, which was destroyed during a 1923 earthquake. The ministry was rebuilt, but plagued with construction accidents and deaths, including that of the financial minister. In 1940, a lightning strike destroyed several nearby offices. Eventually, a bank set up business next to Masakato's grave. In order to appease the seemingly angry spirit, they opened an account in his name. Bank employees were also instructed not to open any windows or to turn their backs on the grave. Pennsylvania, 2019. 32-year-old Luke Dell was arrested for attempting to rob a bank. While that doesn't sound too disturbing, his plan, however, was quite devious. He left a note at a restaurant claiming that active shooters with bombs were headed to a pair of nearby high schools. This would tie up the local police while he robbed 2 banks. The man was arrested after police used the restaurant's parking lot camera to track him down. He was found wearing a mask that made him appear to be older. The list of charges he faces include reckless threat to use a weapon of mass destruction and theft. Alaska, 1990. A father and son went camping in the cold Alaskan wilderness. After a pleasant dinner, they turned in. Around midnight, both woke up to their tent violently shaking. There was neither wind nor rain. The shaking stopped for a few moments. Could it have been an animal? Or another human being? The shaking started again and didn't stop for an hour. Once it stopped, the father ran out with a flashlight and found he and his son were all alone. The next day, they reported the incident to park rangers. They suspected someone with night vision goggles had messed with them, but it was only a suspicion. What really happened?